Welcome to the digestion chapter for nutrition and meal planning. So this chapter is going to look at the physiology of how we digest food, and then we'll talk a little bit about digestive disorders as well. This is just kind of an opening review from maybe high school science, but so just so we have an idea of some words that we're using. So when we talk about cells, cells are the smallest functional unit of a living organism. This is an example of a cell. Again, you have all the organelles, nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, cell membrane. You don't need to know those for the purpose of this class. Just hopefully you've maybe heard those words before somewhere, even if it's been a long time. And so that's, kind of the basis of an organism. Then we have tissues, and tissues are a collection of cells that have similar origin and do similar things. So the lining of small intestine is different types of epithelial tissue. Then moving on to organs, and an organ is an assembly of cells of different tissue types that then all have one function. And so, for example, the small intestine is composed of cells from connective, nervous, and muscle, as well as the epithelial cells. And then an organ system is a group of organs that work together to carry out one or more functions. And so again, the small intestine, for example, is just one organ that makes up the gastrointestinal organ system. And so we'll be talking about that gastrointestinal system, or GI system, as I'll probably commonly refer to that as we go throughout. So what does digestion mean? So there are actually four words that we look at here. So ingestion is eating, so taking food into the body. Digestion then is mechanically and chemically breaking down food into absorbable units that are small enough for us to absorb. Absorption then is actually taking in the food from the GI tract into the body, so absorbing the nutrients into our body for our use. And then excretion is any undigested material in our diet and other waste being eliminated through the body. So those are our four words that we'll talk about in terms of digestion here. It takes food of varying amounts. It depends on a lot of things. It can depend on an individual's GI tract, their activity level, the foods they've eaten. There's lots of different things that can play in this, but it can take between 24 and 72 hours for food from the time you eat it through it's completely out of the GI system. So what organs do we have? So the GI tract, so technically where food goes through, is a tube that extends from the mouth to the anus where digestion and absorption occur. So the five main things we look at here are the mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestines, and large intestine. So those are our five organs that we look at mostly with the GI tract. We also have some accessory organs that play a vital role, but they're not necessarily part of the actual tract, so not part of that tube that food goes through. So those are our salivary glands, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. And we'll talk about these in more detail. So this just visualizes that. So we can start with briefly talking about what they do, and we'll go into more detail. The mouth, chewing mixes food with saliva and begins mechanical digestion. Then the esophagus carries food from the mouth to the stomach. The stomach adds acids, enzymes, gastric juices to food and grinds it, kind of mechanical digestion, into a semi-liquid form. Our small intestine further breaks down our nutrients using enzymes, and then that's also the main site where nutrients are absorbed into our blood and lymphatic system. And then the large intestine is where most of the absorption of water occurs, as well as some vitamins and minerals, and waste material is passed out for excretion. In terms of our accessory organs, the salivary glands secrete saliva that moistens our food, makes it easier for us to swallow. There are a few digestive enzymes, such as salivary amylase there. The liver produces bile, and bile is required for the digestion of lipids. Bile is then stored in the gallbladder. So it's produced in the liver, stored in the gallbladder, and released from the gallbladder into the small intestine. And then finally, the pancreas produces lots of enzymes that digest our macronutrients, and also releases bicarbonate to help neutralize the really acidic chyme coming from the stomach. So that's kind of an overview. Let's go talk about some more terms with digestion. So we have two major types of digestion, mechanical and chemical. Mechanical digestion is the physical breakdown of food by chewing and mixing with digestive juices, whereas chemical uses enzymes and other substances to break down the food. Our goal with digestion is to get our food in the smallest units so we can absorb it. So for a big protein, we want to get it down into the individual amino acids for our body to absorb. Our GI muscles can contract, so there's motility that happens that helps food move through the GI system. So peristalsis are wave-like contractions of the smooth muscle. I always somehow think of like a tube of toothpaste, like squeezing it, a giant tube of toothpaste, trying to squeeze it several ways to get it all flowing throughout with peristalsis. And then segmentation is circular muscles that kind of mix food back, and I'll show you some pictures of that as well. So this is the peristalsis. So those contractions allow food to pass down in the digestive system. So it's not just gravity that's working. We actually have muscles that are propelling food from our mouth to our stomach. And then this is that segmentation, and they're using colors here just to show you that it's making, if you had blue and yellow, it's not really what it looks like, but mixing back and forth, and so it's showing you it makes green, but it just, gentle mixing back and forth allows those fluids, the chyme and the digestive juices to all mix effectively in the small intestine. We also have several enzymes and hormones that play a role in chemical digestion. And so an enzyme is a protein that speeds up a chemical reaction. And so we have three major ones in digestion: lipases, amylases, and proteases. And these just help break things down faster. Helps us be able to speed up that digestion process. And then hormones are chemical substances that are messengers, and so these are also sent. There are a ton of hormones which really are beyond the scope, the amount that there are of this class, but there are a bunch of chemical substances in digestion that control body processes, that send signals when you're full, hungry, etc. So let's start with the mouth. So you eat an apple. So digestion begins in the mouth. So your teeth break food down. So chewing helps you mix it with saliva, helps you break things down into smaller pieces. Then you have food broken down, mixed with saliva, called a bolus. So now the bolus, you're swallowing that. You have amylase that starts the breakdown of the carbohydrates in the mouth a little bit, but not a ton of breakdown or digestion happens in the mouth. You have 5 basic tastes, and so your taste buds are also in your mouth. And there's been a lot of changing in our thinking about taste buds and where they're at, etc. in the last couple of years. But we have 5 basic tastes, so salt, salty, sour, sweet, bitter, and umami is the newest. And umami, I best describe it as like savory, meaty, mushrooms, beef, those kind of things have umami tendencies to that. So your mouth plays a role in all of this. Your esophagus then is really a tube from the mouth to the stomach. Your epiglottis is this flap-like structure then that prevents food from entering the trachea. So if you can imagine, you know, we breathe and eat through our mouth, and so you have your trachea, which is your windpipe, which goes into your lungs, and then the esophagus, which is carrying food down to the stomach. And so you need to prevent food from going into the trachea or into your lungs. So there's what's called the epiglottis, which is that structure that will fold over the trachea when you're swallowing. If food gets lodged in the trachea, that's choking. And you may have all done this at some point, even with water, where it's, you know, goes down the wrong pipe, or you hear that, and that can happen. And so that's kind of what we're referring to here. So once it gets down, we have a sphincter, the gastroesophageal sphincter, which is a ring-like muscle that relaxes and contracts to open and close. So that just controls the rate of flow from food from the esophagus into the stomach. So digestion doesn't really occur in the esophagus, it's really just carrying that food down. The stomach is mostly a holding tank for food and beverages as well. It can hold up to 4 cups. Everyone's a little bit different on that. It may take 2 to 4 hours for food to empty out of the stomach, depending on the meal composition. Not a lot of digestion occurs here. There is some gastric juice. There is hydrochloric acid and other gastric juices happening. There's some starting to break down of some things. We're mixing, there's a little bit of mechanical digestion. We're mixing the food with the gastric secretions to create chyme. But most of the digestion in terms of breaking down those nutrients into smaller pieces through enzymes occurs in the small intestine. This will show you that the stomach is muscular. You can see the sphincters that control the release or food going into the stomach from the esophagus, and then the release through the pyloric sphincter into the small intestines. And that just controls the rate of flow, etc. This will show you some of that digestion and some of the peristalsis contractions you can see in the chyme, what that looks like. So the small intestine has three parts. So the duodenum or duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. And most absorption occurs in the jejunum. In the first part, the duodenum, that's where you have the bicarbonate coming in from the pancreas that helps neutralize that really acidic stomach chyme from the stomach. And then you have a whole bunch of villi and microvilli. I'll show you a picture of these, but these finger-like projections that greatly increase the surface area that helps us become much more efficient at absorption. There are a bunch of digestive enzymes on these enterocytes that help break down and absorb nutrients. So this is what these villi and microvilli look like, and that just shows you how we can increase the surface area greatly, and so all of those can help absorb our nutrients into our small intestine, and then they go either into the blood, so you can see the capillaries there, into the bloodstream for our water-soluble things, and then our fat-soluble vitamins and lipids must go through the lymphatic system. So briefly, let me talk about the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. We mentioned it before, but just noting that the liver produces bile, which is important for fat digestion. This is then released in the duodenum from the gallbladder and then reabsorbed and returned to the liver. So there is some recycling of bile that happens. Again, bile is stored in the gallbladder and released from the gallbladder into the small intestine. And then the pancreas produces pancreatic juices. We talked about the bicarbonate mixture has lots of enzymes, and that also is secreted into the small intestine, either from the bile duct or the pancreatic duct. So we've talked about absorption. Most of our nutrient absorption occurs in the small intestine. We're pretty efficient at it, and so for our macronutrients. So 95% of protein, carbs, fat, and alcohol are absorbed. Our absorptive cells are turned over and replaced every 2 to 5 days, so we're pretty efficient. There are several different ways of absorption, and I'm not going to include this on the test, but just so you're aware, and if you go further in science or biochemistry or physiology, you may study this even in more detail. But simple diffusion, so the molecules can move freely across the membrane from high concentration to lower concentration. Facilitated diffusion, some substances need like a protein carrier to get through, and some of our things need active transport, so they need energy. So they require ATP to be absorbed. And so this just depends on how things are absorbed, how efficient it is, etc. So like I said, we're very efficient at our macronutrients. Our vitamins and mineral absorption rates really vary on a lot of things. There are some that we may only absorb 10% of what we take in some situations. So it's not as efficient, and that's actually kind of a safeguard. It's a good thing. But our macronutrients were very efficient at absorption. So we then transport nutrients, and like I mentioned, the water-soluble nutrients are transported in the cardiovascular system, so through the blood vessels, while our fat-soluble nutrients are transported via the lymphatic system. So that's just the big distinction to note here. Our large intestine then, most of our nutrients have been absorbed, but there's water, some minerals, and our undigested food fibers that pass from the small intestine into the large intestine. It's made up of the colon, rectum, and anus, and there are 5 different sections of the colon you can see there as well. There are 3 main functions, and that's the most important thing from this slide. The 3 main functions of the large intestine are to house bacterial flora, and so we'll talk about that. Or excuse me, we shouldn't say flora anymore. We've changed the wording on that, but really the gut bacteria is what we're talking about there, so our microbiome. Absorbs water and electrolytes, and then forms and expels feces. So those are the 3 major functions of the large intestine. So you can see here what it looks like. So the appendix is attached to that. The ileum, you can see ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and you can see the surface, it would be covered by bacteria. So there's just bacteria all throughout our large intestines. And sorry that kind of, the formatting changed when it updated, so I apologize for that slide. But what that says is probiotics are those live beneficial bacteria in fermented foods, and you've probably heard of probiotics. Prebiotics are the non-digestive carbohydrates or fibers that foster the growth of good bacteria, so that are important in our diet to help maintain our good bacteria. And our beneficial bacteria are really important. There's a lot of estimates that we have more bacteria cells in our body than human cells even, so think on that for a second. Kind of a crazy statement. But it's weird to think about, but we do have a lot of roles for good bacteria in our body. It can help keep the growth of pathogenic bacteria under control, and we're learning more and more about how our gut health and our microbiome affect different disease states and things like that. So we are still really new into this science. We still don't know a lot. There's still a lot that's unknown, but it's important to think about. It's pretty cool. So the antibiotics, other disease treatments can reduce the number of good bacteria that we have. So all of those things matter. You can see some things, the colon can help with vitamin absorption, water absorption. Our electrolytes are absorbed often in the colon, and that also produces short-chain fatty acids. And we're learning a lot more about the role that those short-chain fatty acids may have in our health. So the benefits of a healthy gut microbiota. So again, may get some energy from undigested carbs, helps improve the mucosal lining of the gut. We think it has a big role in our immune system health. We're still learning exactly how. May help with mineral absorption, may reduce cancer risk, may help get rid of some bad bacteria, can help synthesize some of our bacteria like vitamin K, folate, and biotin. So there's lots of roles in that. You can see even the prebiotics promote the growth of the beneficial microbes in our intestine and how that helps. So you can look at those carbohydrates there as well, and how it may help promote the growth of more of our good bacteria, so help getting rid of some of the pathogenic bacteria. There's some sources there. You can see probiotic foods, so fermented dairy foods like yogurt, kefir, other kombucha, soy, tempeh, sauerkraut, those kind of things, kimchi, breast milk's a source. So there really aren't a ton of natural probiotic foods in our diet. But we hopefully eat a lot of prebiotic foods. You can see there some of our onion, garlic, leeks, some of our whole grains, lentils, those kind of things can be really good sources of prebiotics as well. This can be really important for maintaining the health of our gut. And this is something that is fascinating to me. I'm really interested in this from a nutrition standpoint. You have to be careful, though, out there with some of the products that are being sold. We don't know a lot. There's some cool things that are starting to look at, like testing your gut microbes, and we think there may be a role in them. But I've heard some of the top scientists on this speak at conferences, and they're still very cautious too, to say, we don't know exactly, how to best treat this, or, we know that gut bacteria changes based on diet, and we know that, it may be related to disease, but in terms of knowing how exactly what we do to treat that, or you need to buy this brand of probiotics and it's going to survive and it's going to help, we don't really have a lot of that research. So it's interesting and it's great, and you'll see a ton more about this in the next couple of years. So really, the more, we can eating some of the probiotic foods, but really eating a lot of the prebiotic foods and overall healthy dietary pattern, activity, all that can help promote our healthy microbes in our gut. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about some of our digestive disorders, and this isn't a huge part, so I'm going to run through some of these quickly, but certainly reach out if you have any questions. So heartburn and GERD are two that we look at, and heartburn is caused when stomach acid backs up into the esophagus. GERD then is our kind of chronic stomach acid, so it's when we have that sphincter relaxing and we have more recurrent serious form of acid reflux that can damage the esophageal lining, can be very painful, etc. So that's one condition that we can have some dietary changes to as well. This just gives an overview of some of these diseases that we're going to look at, if that's helpful for you to look at too, but I'm going to break them down a little bit more. Gastritis is inflammation of the stomach, and so this can be caused by several different things: medications, alcohol, H. pylori infection. So there's lots of other things that can affect our HCl production, our hydrochloric acid production as well. So this can be painful in lots of ways. An ulcer is a part of this, and it's a very small erosion on the top layer of cells in the stomach or duodenum. And this can be caused by the H. pylori bacterial infection and heavy use of NSAIDs, which NSAIDs are a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medication, so like Advil, things like that. So overuse of those we think can increase our risk of these GI tract damage. We used to say that ulcers were just from stress. That was the biggest thing you always heard. And I'm not saying, stress plays a role in our overall health, so stress could definitely contribute, but we've learned that H. pylori is a is a bacteria that definitely is related to this breakdown, and so this infection can be a part of it. Gallstones, then, are stones that develop in the gallbladder. Cholesterol and bile pigments can form these crystal particles, and when we get a bunch of them, it can be very painful. It can require someone to have their gallbladder removed. Even like really rapid weight loss, some of those kind of things increases the risk for gallstones as well. So this is something, if someone doesn't have their gallbladder, they can, instead of storing bile in the gallbladder, it will just be taken directly from the liver into the small intestine. So you can live without that. There are some people who, after they have the gallbladder removed, have trouble eating fatty foods. Some people can, after a month or two, can go back to eating normal and don't really have trouble with fatty foods. So it really just depends on the individual on that. Okay, so food intolerances is something I want to talk about, and we're learning more about these as well. These are different from food allergies, and we'll clearly talk about food allergies in another chapter. But food intolerances could be several different things. So lactose or lactase intolerance is something you may have heard. So lactose is the intolerance of that's the sugar in milk that people may have a hard time digesting, and lactase is the digestive enzyme for that they may be deficient in. There may be other components like gluten that someone may be sensitive to, and we're learning more about that. Synthetic components like MSG, some people have issues with, but MSG is kind of making a comeback because overall it's thought to be safe for most people. Residues of medications, chemicals, other toxic contaminants like mold, bacteria, things like that. So we're learning a lot more about food intolerances. I want to caution sometimes diagnosing food intolerances on someone's own. Sometimes people mistake symptoms like you haven't eaten fiber in a while, so you eat more fiber, and so there's a little bit of bloating. Your gut bacteria are feeding off of that and producing gas, and that's not really a bad thing. People may mistake those symptoms for an intolerance to that food. Stress can cause can cause some of those same symptoms of food intolerance. There's been some thought that even being afraid of a food ingredient, like being told, oh, this is bad for you, can make people have symptoms of food intolerances or indigestion from that. So just something to think about. It's a lot more complicated. So I always caution people from diagnosing themselves with a food intolerance. But again, we're learning more about that. You also have to be really careful with some of the tests, like the food intolerance tests that you can get, because some of those, what they're really actually testing is like, have you ever been exposed to that food? And so if you've eaten it, it may show that you're intolerant to it. And so sometimes I have people come to my office with like really long lists of foods that they're intolerant to, only from a test that did it. And most medical professionals don't recognize there are some that are valid, but don't recognize some of these food intolerance tests alone as truly a way to measure someone's intolerance. So someone could then be cutting all these foods out of their diet unnecessarily, and that can be really problematic for getting enough nutrition. So just something to mention in that. It's a lot more complicated than some groups are trying to make it seem. Okay, a couple of other, just constipation is something that we can look at, low fiber diets, and you can see some other supplements, things like that can affect that. So that's something that we can be concerned about in terms of disease risk and pain and other problems. Diverticular disease as well, so diverticulosis, diverticulitis is a condition where there are these small pouches or pockets in the wall of the lining of the GI tract, and these can get infected, inflamed, and cause a lot of pain. And so diet may be, certain restrictions and things may be put on a diet. Other things, most people have probably experienced some of these at some point in their life, but diarrhea can be a common GI problem. Things like sugar alcohols can cause it. There's lots of reasons you can get that, but really the intestinal cells are releasing fluid instead of absorbing it. This can actually turn into a very serious problem, and especially in children, and especially in some other countries in the world that may not have as good access to medical care and clean water. We see childhood diarrhea can be a common cause of death in children if it's not treated properly. Again, we don't see that much in the United States, but it's definitely something worldwide in public health that we think about. Gas can be caused by swallowed air or bacteria breaking down the fiber, things like that. And then vomiting can be caused by lots of things. It could be because you're sick, could be because stress, could be motion sickness. So lots of things can affect all of these symptoms. I wanted to briefly mention celiac disease just because it's talked about a lot. So this is an autoimmune disease in which ingestion of gluten creates damage in the small intestine. So this is technically different than a wheat allergy. Gluten is the protein found in wheat, barley, and rye. And it's definitely different than an intolerance. But this can lead to nutrient malabsorption, stunted growth, anemia, bone loss. I have a friend who has celiac disease, and it can be difficult to diagnose. And she actually, before diagnosis, didn't have any like GI symptoms. Like people assume you would have like GI pain or something. But really, she was a runner and kept getting stress fractures. And so they couldn't, trying to figure out why. And that was kind of one of the signs with that, because there's bone loss, other things that happen as part of celiac disease, as that gluten can damage the small intestine. And so, someone with celiac disease really needs to avoid gluten and cross-contamination with gluten from foods. So, being careful that, they're not eating bread, but also that their chicken wasn't grilled on the same flat top as, grilled cheese. So things like that we have to be careful with. And then I want to talk about IBS and IBD briefly. So irritable bowel syndrome is a group of symptoms: pain, bloating, diarrhea. There's some thought that up to 20% of adults show some sign of IBS. There may be certain foods that trigger it. Stress can trigger it. There can be lots of different things that can trigger IBS, which can make it really complicated to diagnose and treat on that. And then inflammatory bowel disease is serious chronic conditions that are caused by immune system reaction, so inflammation of the GI tract. So ulcerative colitis and Crohn's are just two different variations of that. These can be very serious for individuals as well. Some people could need surgery, medication, other things with that. So there are lots of complications with the GI system. It's fascinating. We're learning more and more about this, how our gut health plays a role in the rest of our body's health, etc. So it's definitely something, if you're interested in this, to keep a lookout for in studies and science and news in the next couple of years. You'll see a lot more. I'm happy to discuss more with you guys, and I will provide an article for you to read as well that's really interesting on this. But please reach out with any questions, and hopefully you enjoyed this. There's also a quick crash course review of the digestive system video that I linked. I like some of their way they talk through the science. So if you want another review of the GI system and how food goes through it, please watch that as well. Thank you.